Chapter 17. Mazin. Mazin's adventure had yet to begin, but he was already tired of it. Walking through the halls in his brother's body, and flashing his condescending smile at others was taking its toll. He hated the way the servants looked at him with fear in their eyes. Gods, even the nobles were nervously talking about him. But no response was worse than the midnight merchant's. While the others averted a gaze, she glared right at him. Mazin knew she hated him. He couldn't fault her, not after his father had ordered him to shadow her last night. Mazin blamed Omar. His brother had thought it wise to test their disguises, so Omar had gone to last night's celebration as Mazin, and Mazin had gone as his brother. He hated that he had been so convincing. Mazin sighed into his coffee. The Sultan looked up from his cup. "You haven't stopped sighing since we sat down. What are you thinking about, Mazin?" Some of the tension eased from his shoulders at the sound of his name. This afternoon he would become Omar, king of the 40 thieves and the high prince of Medine. But right now, seated before his father in the diwan, he was blissfully himself. The usual. Mazin blew on his coffee. Jinn, shadows, nightmares. The Sultan set down his cup. It was the same one he always used, a small porcelain cup decorated with multicolored roses. It was the same pattern Mazin's mother had used. She and the Sultan had shared the set. The Jinn is dead, and if the gods are just, burning in hell. Mazin nearly choked on his drink. It didn't matter that the shadow Jinn had nearly killed him. He still felt pity for her. It was a weakness, he knew, one he had no right to, and yet he could not stop thinking of the rage and pain that had clouded her mind. The Sultan shook his head. "This will never happen again. Once I have the lamp, I will destroy the Jinn. All of them." When Mazin said nothing, the Sultan leaned forward, bushy brows drawn together. "Why are you against this search? The Midnight Merchant is a criminal. I'm giving her a chance to redeem herself." "Not all Jinn are evil, Yuba. Mother used to say that in her stories. You remember?" Mazin knew he'd said the wrong thing when the Sultan's expression went icy. "Has your memory grown so patchy you do not remember she was killed by one of those Jinn? But she believed your mother, God bless her soul, was soft-hearted." His eyes sparked with some emotion Mazin couldn't place. "I'll be damned if I let the Jinn take you because you inherited her sentimentality. Remember, Mazin, the desert is no place for bleeding hearts." Mazin's mother had once said the opposite, that in their country a soft heart was more valuable because the desert dried out a person's emotions. But he did not say this to his father. The Sultan drew back with a sigh. "I hope you understand. I just want what's best for you." His gaze was thoughtful as he refilled his cup from the dala. "That is why I've decided to have you trained in swordplay." He didn't even look up when Mazin cringed. "It will give you something to fill your days with until Omar returns. I want you to remain in the palace. It is safer here." Mazin set down his cup before it fell from his hands. His mother had not believed in responding to violence with violence. It was the reason he'd never been trained to use a weapon. The reason the Sultan had stepped down as the king of the 40 thieves. But that had been before her death. Mazin ought to have known it would only be a matter of time before his father put a blade in his hands. If only he knew it was Omar who was going to wield the blade. It was almost humorous. While he would have to pretend to be adept at using sword, Omar would have to play at being incompetent. It seemed they would both have their work cut out for them. His father smiled. Not a crooked smile, but an earnest one. "This will be good for you. Who has ever heard of a prince who doesn't know how to use a weapon? You hold the weight of a kingdom on your shoulders, Mazin. You cannot protect it with just good intentions." His father had a point. Never mind the fact that Mazin could barely pick a blade for fear of having to plunge it in some living thing, or that he detested violence. He was glad, at least, that it would be Omar who bore the bloody weight of their kingdom in the future. Mazin had never wanted anything less than he wanted the throne. "If it is boredom you fear, do not worry." The Sultan blew on his coffee. "We will fill our days with productive work. I have already told the counselors you will start attending our meetings. I expect to see you at our afternoon gathering tomorrow. Understood?" Ah, so swordplay and politics were to be his routine for the foreseeable future. But Mazin would not step into that life. Not yet. "Yes, Yuba," he said softly. That was how he said goodbye to his father, not with a hug or a kiss to the forehead, but with an admission. When he left the Diwan, his heart was heavy with everything left unsaid. It was the 5th hour of sunrise when he made it to Hakim's study. He'd been preparing for his journey, packing clothes that were not his, and conversing with Omar about things he needed to know as the king of the 40 thieves. His brother had given him most of his possessions, everything except for his crescent earring, which he refused to part with. It was the only thing missing from Mazin's disguise now that he stood outside Hakim's door. Hesitantly, he rapped on the wood in the pattern he always used and entered when Hakim bade him to do so. Hakim's room was unchanged, still full of tomes and shadows and maps. "Mazin, you're unusually quiet today." Hakim swiveled on his chair. The moment he saw Mazin, he tensed. "Omar?" Mazin hated watching his normally composed brother become uncomfortable at Omar's appearance. It was, Mazin knew, his fault. Years ago, after his mother had told him about Hakim's existence, he had begged his father to bring him back to the palace he'd been banished from. He'd wanted someone to play with, someone who would treat him like a brother, unlike Omar, and so, begrudgingly, the Sultan had tracked down Hakim's mother's tribe and brought him to the palace. For Mazin, he'd given Hakim the honorary title of prince, even though he was not of his blood. Hakim, 2 years younger than Omar, had been closer in both age and temperament to Mazin. His arrival had marked the beginning of a more peaceful time, at least until Mazin's mother died, and the Sultan locked Hakim in his room and allowed Omar to belittle him. My fault, my fault. Mazin felt a stab of shame, knowing he'd been the one to separate Hakim from his tribe. As a child, he'd insisted Hakim was his family. He'd realized only in retrospect, once his brother was trapped here, how selfish he'd been. He forced the thought to the back of his mind as he pulled the bangle from his wrist and managed a weak smile when Hakim startled. "Salam, Hakim." "Mazin!" Hakim fell back against his desk. "You nearly gave me a heart attack." "My apologies. I haven't had the opportunity to take this damn thing off until now." "Is there a reason you're using magic to masquerade as Omar?" Hakim eyed the bangle. "Is that a relic?" Yes and yes. Mazin's smile fell as he drew closer. The map the Sultan had presented to Rasul and Luli lay stretched on Hakim's desk. His brother had added more traveling routes. He could feel Hakim scrutinizing him. He expected a gasp, a grumble, but when Hakim next spoke, his voice was calm. "You plan on taking Omar's place today." Mazin swallowed. "You remember the favor I owe him? This is it. He wants me to accompany the merchant, pretend to be him." "And you're going to do it?" Hakim stood abruptly. His broad shoulders and impressive height made Mazin feel small and insignificant. "You would willingly head into a desert filled with cutthroats and jinn just to keep your secret safe from the Sultan?" Mazin stepped back and out of his brother's shadow. "But if he knew—" "He loves you, Mazin. You are his favorite. He would never hurt you." Mazin almost laughed. "Me? His favorite? How could Hakim think that? His father never listened to him. He did not even trust him. He gave all the important responsibilities to Omar, but Mazin knew Hakim would argue with him until the sun set, so he humored him. Then his love blinds him. He never sees reason with me. Is it so wrong that he wants you to have an escort outside the palace?" Mazin shook his head. "Now I am to be trapped in the palace at all times." He paused, realizing how spoiled he sounded. Hakim wasn't even allowed to attend palace events without the Sultan's permission, and here he was complaining. He wished he could take the words back, but he couldn't bring himself to speak into the awkward quiet. He busied his hands instead, reaching into the satchel to withdraw his mother's scarf, which was vibrant even in the gloom of Hakim's dark study. Hakim fell back onto his chair, shoulders slumped. "You are not just leaving because of the Sultan, are you? It's for the Midnight Merchant, and because you want to escape the palace." Mazin swallowed. He did want to leave Medine. He did want to help the Midnight Merchant. Even if he wasn't what was up to the task, he owed her. Hakim chuckled, a soft sound that made Mazin's heart sink. "I know you better than you know yourself." He held out his hand. "I know you brought the scarf because you want me to keep it safe, and I know your mind is made up. You have the Sultan's stubbornness in you." Mazin wanted to object, but Hakim had a point. "As always, you see right through me. You wear your heart on your sleeve. Hakim took the scarf from him and began to roll up his map. Who else knows of this switch? Your servants? Karima? Mazen shook his head. No one. I cannot risk sharing this secret. What about the midnight merchant? Do you not think she would be more willing to travel with you if she knew your true identity? Mazen's heart twisted with guilt. He hated lying to Luli al-Nazari, but what choice did he have? She despised the Sultan. If she found out Mazen's secret, what was to stop her from using it as blackmail against his father? If that happened, the Sultan would never forgive him. Mazen liked Luli, but he feared for his father more. Hakim nodded solemnly when Mazen told him this. Then I alone will keep an eye on Omar, he frowned. It bothers me that he would put his own personal business before the Sultan's, and that he would send you on such a dangerous journey. It was bothersome, but not surprising. As a child, Omar had dared Mazen to do all sorts of dangerous things, only to laugh when he injured himself. I have marked the most well-traveled routes on the map. Hakim handed it to him. The fastest route will take you through Daim and Giban. Mazen smiled wryly. Ah, yes, exactly what I need. Cities full of people to act for. Hakim said nothing, only stared at him quietly, his bright eyes shadowed in the dim firelight. Mazen clutched the map to his chest, heart suddenly tight. He had no right to lament his trickery in front of his brother who was trapped here because of him. I'm sorry, Hakim. The apology came out whisper-thin. He blinked. For what? Mazen gestured feebly about the chamber, at the towering stacks of tomes, at the maps pinned atop each other on the walls because there was no space. If it weren't for him, Hakim would be out in the desert drawing his maps. Instead, he sat here, a prisoner, handing Mazen the key to his escape. The shadows on Hakim's face shifted when he smiled, drawing dark crescents beneath his eyes that made him look much older than his 25 years. I told you before, you owe me no apologies. Besides, now it is not time for them. Mazen swallowed the knot in his throat. No, now is the time for goodbyes. Hakim stood and embraced him first, and it was all Mazen could do to return it without trembling. When Hakim drew back, his eyes glistened with unshed tears. May the stars guide your path and the gods keep you safe. And remember, Mazen, he clapped a hand on his shoulder, when in doubt, there is no better person to be than yourself. Mazen forced himself to smile. I would never hope to be anyone else. He did not tell his brother that on this journey he would be useless as himself, and that deep down he'd begun to fear this would always be the case.